Boom, we're live. This is Tio and the Arcane Bear. We have a wonderful guest for you today. One of the rabbit holes that I have been diving down since I was quite young. We have Mark HADEN. He's the Executive Director of M.A.P.S, or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He's also the Adjunct Professor at UBC for Population and Public Health. Mark HADEN, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
It is a pleasure. I'm doing fine.
Nice. Mark's currently situated in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia, and I guess the best way to start this is kind of lead us how you got into this space and what background you have working in the health sector.
Well, can I go back to the introduction? I'm actually the Executive Director of M.A.P.S Canada.
Oh, M.A.P.S Canada.
Because Rick Doblin is the Executive Director of M.A.P.S USA. So we're a branch of M.A.P.S USA. M.A.P.S USA is intending to become truly international. And Rick and I have known each other for many years. So he's reached out to me. And so M.A.P.S Canada is alive and well. So what was your question?
No. Perfect. Thank you for clarifying. I guess I did forget to mention there that M.A.P.S is a multinational company that studies psychedelics as well. Can you tell us some of your background, how you came into this space and what brought you here?
Sure, absolutely. So I really kind of have two hats on. I work with the process of public health, and I've been articulating post-prohibition models for the regulation and control of all currently illegal drugs based on public health principles for many years. So I believe that drug prohibition will end. And I ask the question is, what should we replace it with? And specifically, what should we replace it with when we look at it with a framework of public health? So that's one of my perspectives in the world. And the other is, how do we legalize psychedelics? Psychedelic medicine is a very powerful experience for many people, and what is the process of legalizing them and how are we going to do it? And those are my two hats that I wear. So I bring those together for this discussion.
Yeah, that's incredible. For me, when I was younger, I thought some of this research would do really well in the medicinal space, but I realized that there wasn't a whole lot of room to grow. So to see disruptive minds like yourself that have actually been able to make some headway with the legislation and infrastructure around the criminal code in Canada, you guys have made some big changes with even being able to do studies in the first place, correct?
It's been a long journey. Certainly, when I first started with M.A.P.S Canada, we did the phase 2 clinical study for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. In order for a drug to become a medicine, it has to go through stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. It has to be proved to be non-toxic in animals, proved to be non-toxic in people, you have to develop a kind of a rationale and a model, then you have to do it with a small scale, and then do it with a large scale. When you finish doing that, the drug becomes the medicine. Now, we were able to succeed under Stephen Harper. For those who don't know Canadian politics, we had a very conservative previous prime minister. And even under Stephen Harper, we were able to do our phase 2 clinical trial. We now have a much more friendly federal government. We have Justin Trudeau in power. He's a liberal, and they're supportive and aren't presenting the same level of blockades that the previous government did. So we're still moving, but we're moving forward more quickly to complete our phase 3 clinical study, after which MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is going to be legal in Canada and the United States.
That's absolutely astounding. I know a lot of these drugs or medicines have been classified as Schedule 1, which in the eyes of the law means that they don't have any medicinal use. But coming from the medicinal side of things, it's obviously been able to prove that they're quite functional. I was reading through some of your work the last few days, some of the stuff you'd sent over. I'll leave the links for all those PDFs below if anyone wants to do more deep dive research into some of the specifics of using MDMA for PTSD and the work that you guys are doing there. But can you tell us what it's like to go up against the regulators and the criminal justice code to really try to change that stuff? Because I imagine it'd be quite difficult.
Well, I described the phase 2 clinical study, the process of working with the federal government, as being the journey of 1,000 emails. And there was just endless back and forth with questions that weren't relevant, but we just kept answering their questions, and we answered them with detail, with precision. It's paying attention to the details. If they want to know an answer to the question, we give it to them, and we give it to them again and again and again and again. And eventually, they let us move forward. Now, it's interesting, it's actually changed now, and it changed for a number of reasons. I mentioned the Justin Trudeau, the Liberal government change, but also the resistance to us has largely melted away, partly because in the United States, the FDA gave this study breakthrough status. Now, what does that actually mean? Because a lot of drugs are in the, or a lot of substances are in the drug discovery pipeline. So they're busily being researched, and they're working with the government to produce them as a medicine. And when the United States government, the FDA, looks at the process and says, this is special enough, this is effective enough, and it's different enough from mainstream treatments that we want to put it on the fast track. We want to make this as available as quickly as possible to the people that need it. They give it breakthrough status, and they did. So they gave MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, the development of MDMA towards a medicine, they gave it breakthrough status, which actually has helped enormously in the speed of us moving forward. It's, I mean, we would have assumed that the FDA would have presented every obstacle like they could, but certainly stepping up to the plate and supporting us has been huge for us.
Yeah, getting the go-ahead, it really opens up the room for, I mean, to move quickly. Otherwise, you're operating under like a fly-by-night scenario. Now, are there any other types of psychoactives or medicinal plants that have been put on that fast track for study and research?
None with psychedelics, no.
No, only MDMA.
In the psychedelic category, yes.
Wow, that's astounding. I guess you have maybe a little easier time controlling the experience of someone on MDMA than, say, something like ayahuasca, which can vary dramatically in each user's personal experience. So with some of the studies that have been going on in the MDMA field, let's stay there for a bit. Can you tell us what type of efficacy you have in comparison with all the regular treatments that are out there today?
Yes. So let's talk about what regular treatments. What is the treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder? And so the main treatment is called prolonged exposure or flooding. There's also other less dominant ones, things like EMDR. But generally speaking, they're relatively ineffective. Now, I went to the Canadian Military Health Conference that happened last year in December in Vancouver. And it was 5 days of wandering around, watching people pitching their treatments to the military. And mostly what I learned from this experience is mostly what the military struggles with is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so most of the presentations were about some organization that had something that they wanted to offer the military. And so I listened to presentation after presentation after presentation, and the most optimistic claims of success was 25%. When I go back and look at the literature, it's closer to 10%. So it's somewhere in that window between 10 and 25% effectiveness. And they tend to be a very long-term treatment. They tend to be years. And if you actually read the literature, what you see is the dropout rate is high. So what does that actually mean? If you're a soldier and you come back from battle and you're having this horrible experience, you really have a tough time leaving your house because the explosions are following you everywhere and you're believing that you're about to be shot. And so you have this trauma, this reoccurring trauma response to everyday experiences. And then you show up at a therapist's office and they want to recreate the trauma in the office. They want to create the trauma and sit you in the environment long enough so you desensitize. You emotionally just get used to it. So most people don't want to do that. They don't want to recreate their trauma. It doesn't work for them as an experience. And so they tend to say, no, thank you, and they walk out. So that's recorded as a dropout. So the dropout rate is high. So it's relatively ineffective. It takes a long time and people don't want to do it. So that's what we're comparing our treatment to. So the first round of work was done by Michael and Annie Mithofer, who are two therapists, and they worked with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And they demonstrate an 83% level of effectiveness. Now, if you're a researcher and you're looking at somebody who's coming along and saying that we can do something at 83% level of effectiveness, and the traditional treatment level of effectiveness is somewhere between 10 and 25%, you're not going to believe it. Because normally when somebody offers an alternative treatment compared to an existing treatment, you're talking about 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5% improvement. To go from 25 to 83 is unheard of. So what you will believe as a researcher is that the person who is making this offer is lying. They are falsifying their data. It can't be true. Okay, so that's a reasonable challenge. So what do we need to do? We need to say, okay, so what we need to do is to have a huge amount of oversight. We need to have things like Health Canada, the FDA, looking at the data and being allowed to review any documentation and watching very closely over our shoulders, and then have a whole variety of different therapists at different sites with different populations being able to replicate the study. So that's essentially what we did. So we did that with the phase 2 clinical trial, and we demonstrated a level of effectiveness. This data isn't published, but it's over 60% effective. So it's still substantially better than existing treatments. So that's why the FDA gave it breakthrough status. And it seems to be that we aren't actually falsifying our data. It seems that we're demonstrating a level of effectiveness that is unparalleled.
That's astounding too. Are there any, so you're saying the majority of the people that end up with PTSD are usually war veterans. Are there childhood cases of trauma, or what's the other avenues that people might end up with PTSD, I guess is the simple question.
Yeah, I didn't say that most people with PTSD got it through war, just to be clear. It's certainly a population of interest to us. So we tend to use those examples, and we're certainly open to treating war veterans. And within the war veteran population, it's a common problem. But yes, I mean, it was interesting. I did the first round of M.A.P.S therapy training, and essentially that's sitting down and watching Michael and Annie Mithofer working on videos. So endless hours of videos. And it was really interesting for me because I went into the room and I went into that training process with an assumption. And the assumption that I made, and I hadn't really articulated my assumption, but as I watched the tapes, I was so surprised because I really believe that they would have cherry picked. By that, I mean, they would have found single incident trauma individuals who are healthy young men and gone to war, or had one particular dramatic event that produced this PTSD response. And I would have believed they would have tried to avoid complex trauma. I've worked for many decades in the addiction services, and many people that show up for the addiction services have enormously complicated trauma that often happens from shortly after their birth. And I viscerally know how difficult it is to help those folks because they show up to our services all the time. And so I would have believed that they would have found healthier people than what I've historically had to deal with. And they didn't. They were treating complex trauma. They were treating people who had all kinds of different bizarrely difficult experiences from a very young age. And they were successfully treating them, which really had a huge impact on me. So it works. It isn't just effective for soldiers. It's effective for a wide range of different individuals who suffer from PTSD.
Are there clinical trials that are also looking at this in use for depression as well, to replace something like the SSRIs?
Well, we're talking about the psychedelic research community generally. So we're leaping out of the MDMA work. And yes, I mean, there's a psychedelic renaissance in research going on today. It's massive. The door is opened to the research community to do psychedelic research. And a lot of people are walking through the door. And yes, depression, the low-hanging fruit, the things that researchers are really excited by, and I believe will produce hugely effective and relatively rapid responses, are things like depression, anxiety, end-of-life anxiety, social anxiety associated with autism. That's an interesting one. Cluster headaches, LSD and psilocybin for cluster headaches. Yeah, there's a whole range of really simple ones. I'm personally interested in both those easier ones to treat, but I'm also interested in some of the tougher ones, and we can have that discussion as well if you'd like.
Yeah, you know a lot more about this space than I do, so maybe lead us down that path. What other sacred plant medicines are they testing, and what type of results have you had in the more abstract areas of healing?
Yes, well, I mean, let's expand the discussion a little bit. So let's talk about the medicines of interest, and let's talk about how they're taken. So I'm going to put my own personal spin on this. So the medicines that I am interested in researching are MDMA, obviously, because that's the study that I'm most involved with. There's another one out there that's also an empathogen, which is called 3-MMC, 3-methylmethcathinone. I think that is certainly one of interest. The classical psychedelics, the two classical psychedelics of psilocybin and LSD are certainly highly of interest to me. And I'm also interested in ketamine therapy and, excuse me, hang on a second.
Yes, of course.
and 5-MeO-DMT are the ones that I'm most interested in. And I'm interested in both flood dosing, which means really large dosages, and microdosing. There's a huge proliferation of interest around people who take very small doses, about 1/10 of a normal recreational dose of things like LSD. It seems to be the one that's most popular, but psilocybin is also used by people. And occasionally people microdose things like Iboga. So the process of microdosing is also of great fascination for me.
Yeah, because with the smaller doses, you can have this a very similar effect without the, I guess, the intense experience that something like mushrooms or LSD brings into a flood dose, which can often be overwhelming and take you to almost an entirely different world very quickly. Can you talk about?
Well, let's look at that for a second. So you originally brought up the issue of depression. So that's one of the I'm going to say diseases, but illnesses, difficulties, struggles that people have, that people talk a lot about how psychedelics could be useful for. And really, there are some folks out there that say that, well, okay, depression has some underlying issues, and if we can resolve the underlying issues, then that will be helpful in the treatment for depression. So that's really talking about a flood dose. So a flood dose being defined as, again, this is not something one does at home. This is not something that's taken out of context. And the context is always about a high level of support and setting people up for the experience, carefully managing the set and the setting, the environment, and the attitude and the expectations of the person, and then allowing for an integration process afterwards. So carefully setting it up. This is not something you just take the medicine and go lie down for a while and it's fixed. That isn't what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about very, very carefully managed psychedelic use. So a flood dose being defined as somewhere in the 200 to 300 micrograms of LSD range, or 20 to 30 milligrams of pure psilocybin, which is approximately 4 to 5 grams of dried cubensis mushrooms. So that's a flood dose. And back to the depression discussion, if you believe that depression is a result of some underlying issue, there's something going on that's a struggle for somebody, then taking a flood dose allows you to access that struggle that the person is having and find a way of resolving it, and finding a way of thinking about the issue in a different way. And hence the person is, quite frankly, healed. They don't have that struggle anymore. If that's how you're thinking about depression and that's the issue, then you really want to be thinking about a flood. You want to be thinking about a flood dose. If you think about depression as being like a brain chemistry issue that is more something that just needs to be balanced from day to day, then you really talk about a microdosing issue. There we go. So I think that the science has yet to answer the question, which is more effective, flood dosing or microdosing. My belief is at the end of the day, there's a place for both, and that sometimes people will be most helped by large dosages infrequently, and sometimes people will be helped by regular smaller doses. And I think that this is a question for science that we have yet to resolve.
Yeah, we just don't have enough of the history with today's level of clinical trials to really say which way might be more effective and for who or why those ideas work. So just to touch back too, I wanted to clarify that you said the FDA had basically greenlit the use of MDMA for these studies. So does that mean MDMA might become somewhat legal or under legal restrictions in the United States as well over the next few years?
Our current time frame is to have MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Just to be clear, we're not talking about MDMA. We're talking about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy legal in both Canada and the United States in about 2021. That's our time frame. Now, it's interesting. What does actually legal mean here? Because I'd like to play with that thought a little bit, because we don't know what that means. So normally, if you've done some sort of bowel inflammatory substance development and you produced a medicine, a pill that helps with bowel inflammation issues, it's pretty uncomplicated. The regulators will say, okay, this is a physical medication. Here's the profile, here's what we know about it, and then it goes to physicians to prescribe. But really what we're saying is this is not just a normal prescription medicine. This is really something that has to happen within context. And there needs to be a lot of skill around how this is made available. So what are the options of the regulators? I mean, the regulator could say, well, this is a doctor who's going to prescribe it, just give it to the regular medical profession. That's one option. There's another option of saying, well, this is a psychiatric medication. So it's really a specialist kind of substance, and psychiatrists have long managed psychiatric medications. Or they could say, we actually need a new profession here. We need to have people that are skilled at doing psychedelic psychotherapy. And then what does that look like? So I've been really interested in that question, partly because it fits with both of my hats. One of my hats is the M.A.P.S. Canada hat of legalizing psychedelics, but the other hat that I wear is post-prohibition models for the regulation and control of all currently illegal drugs. That's my public health hat. So both of those hats come together to answer the question, what should the process of legalization of psychedelics look like? And specifically MDMA, but I'd like to throw in all the other ones as well, because slowly more and more psychedelics will come on stream as the research matures and these substances become medicines. We will have access to more and more of them over time. So I've made a proposal. It's available. You can Google it. It's if you Google my name or look on my website, markhaden.com. It's my proposal for how psychedelics should be regulated. So I start with observing that all drugs have three potential harms: toxicity, addiction, and behavior. So let's look at those three potential harms when it comes to psychedelics. So addiction. Now, I've worked in the addiction services for 30 years, and nobody ever walked into my office saying, I can't stop taking LSD or magic mushrooms. It never happened. So the dependency potential for the classical psychedelics specifically is incredibly low. Let's talk about toxicity. Now, Albert Hofmann, who invented LSD, believed it was one of the least toxic substances on the planet. And there are certainly examples of people who took massive LSD overdoses accidentally and took thousands of dosages and survived the experience. Now, let's compare that to water, for example. If you took 1,000 dosages of water, what's a dosage of water? A couple of cups a day, 3, 4 cups a day? So if you took 1,000 times that, you'd be dead. So if you look at, if you took 1,000 times a dosage of aspirin, you'd be dead. I mean, most medicines will kill you if you do thousands of times the recommended dosage. That's not true with LSD. So if you look at the toxicity profile generally of psychedelics, they appear to be very, very low toxicity. So we don't really have a problem with addiction, and we don't have a problem with toxicity. But if one of the things that I do is I have Google alerts on my computer with all of the different psychedelics. And so every day I get flooded with where these different psychedelics have appeared in the media. And there are a lot of absolutely awful stories about things that have gone wrong. And when I look at the story and I ask myself one question is, what's the problem here? What's the issue? What drove this? What created this problem? And it's always one or two things. It's either people who had access to impure drugs. What they took was unknown dosage with unknown purity, which legalization would solve immediately. People would know their dosage and know their purity. But the other problem that is more common is behavior. People who are essentially unsupervised, who aren't doing it in some kind of thoughtful, constructive, guided place that is supervised by elders and has some level of wisdom associated with the experience. So when that's missing, people sometimes behave incredibly badly and they make all kinds of mistakes. And you can go into Erowid.com, Erowid being a vast repository of trip reports and knowledge about substances. And if you just start to read the trip reports, And it's horrible. Some people's experiences is completely obnoxious. And so how do we fix that? Well, what we do is we need to allow people to. So we need a new profession. We need a profession that is essentially called psychedelic supervisors. Now, this new profession can have many, just like physicians, they can have many different specialties. You know, you can have a psychedelic supervisor who is specialized at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. But we could also have one for ayahuasca. We could have one for peyote ceremonies. We could have one for multi-day dance festivals. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the context of the psychedelic experience is. All that matters is somebody is in charge. They've planned it out. They've managed set, which is the expectation. They've screened people appropriately. Psychedelic experiences are not for everybody. And they manage the setting in a way that minimizes harm and maximizes benefit. And they're there for the person for 8 hours after ingestion, and they darn sure they don't drive home at the end of the day. So, so basically they maximize the safety. They focus on safety, and they create a situation which is structured. So I call that a licensed supervisor. By licensed, I mean that they should be responsible to a professional body. You know, they should have like doctors and accountants and veterinarians who all are accountable for what they offer. So this should be a body of professional people who, if there's a problem, if somebody doesn't like what they did, there's somebody to complain to, and they have to adhere to best practices. They have to work with their community to develop best practices, and then teach each other and work with the community to help provide the best possible experience. So they have to supervise with wisdom is what they have to do. Now, I presented this idea at a lot of conferences for many years. And inevitably, somebody would stand up at the back and say, I object. And what they would say to me was essentially this. They would say, I love psychedelics. And what I do with my wife, when we both take a psychedelic and jump into bed together, I do not want supervised. And you know something? They had a point. So eventually, when me and my fellow authors just kind of struggled with that, we said, okay, we need to have two tracks. There's the licensed supervisors who can provide service for payment, and they can be professional. They can be paid for the skill that they offer. But there also needs to be another track. So there's the certification track. And the certification track allows individuals who either want to self-supervise or supervise friends to do it within the context of their home environment. So they want to go and purchase a psychedelic and take it home for home use. And they do need to have some training, you know, and the training probably looks like a couple of weekends. So the first weekend is all about setting, safety, and dosage issues, so that people have knowledge, you know, what dosage, what will 500 mics of LSD do to you? You know, what's that going to be like for you? You know, you're going to have a very disoriented ego. What does that mean? You know, so it's knowledge. So the first weekend would be knowledge transition or translation. And the second weekend would be experiential. You know, if somebody who is really skilled will show up and offer the experience where setting, safety, and screening issues have all been well managed. And so somebody who wants to get the certificate would do this 2-weekend training course. And then they would have a certificate that would allow them to purchase a psychedelic for take-home use to be used with either loved ones or friends. So essentially, that's the model that we proposed. There's a licensed professional and a certified person who just wants to use psychedelics in the context of their own home. So that's the bottom line in terms of how I recommend the federal bureaucrat who looks at our research and says, how are we going to regulate this? That's my proposal as to what they come up with.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Through my studies, the first time I took ayahuasca was in around 2005, and it was with an extremely talented curandero from Peru. And this woman could sing. I'm pretty sure she sang straight through for 14 hours, and I can't instill how important that singing that holding space, the creation of improvisational like vibrations, how important that is during a flood dose, because vibration seems to be exponentially more powerful. I remember the music at one point would make me feel either sick or happy to some, or at least it felt that way. So I think you're right on the money there. Is that one of the most dangerous, or not dangerous, but one of the most abstract parts about here is the set and setting. Is, do you have someone that can hold the space, that knows how much or what to do in the chance that things go awry? So I think you're focusing on one of the most important parts there, which is fantastic. So have they made much ground, or have you made any headway with this type of certification or the legal body that would govern these types of facilitators?
No. And it's not the federal government bureaucrats who will be making these decisions aren't there yet. So my goal is just to have a public dialogue around these issues, so that when they have to make the decision, there's a collective belief system about how it should work. So that, I mean, I also, if you look at the organization I work with, it's called M.A.P.S Canada. What is M.A.P.S? It's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So I also believe that who is sitting around the table at the end of the day should be a lot of different voices. I mean, let's just go through the list. So I believe that psychiatrists should be part of the discussion, because they're used to managing mental illness medications. I believe that psychologists should be part of the discussion, because they're used to managing what happens between people's ears. I believe that social workers should be part of the discussion, because they're used to running groups and providing couples and family therapy, and psychedelics can be very helpful in that context. I believe that Aboriginal people, Aboriginal elders who've been doing this for years, the peyote folks, the ayahuasca folks, should be at the table because of their vast experience that they bring to this. So I believe that underground therapists of a variety of sorts who've been doing this for long periods of time should be at the table to bring their knowledge. So it really is about being inclusive. And so how do we get an inclusive discussion going where we develop appropriate best practices for the process of psychedelic guiding or psychedelic psychotherapy or psychedelic work, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because you have so many like, I guess, like you're saying, all these different disciplines, which can be very valuable in that space as facilitators. As for me, I think the music was probably one of the most profound aspects of the healing process, because I felt the almost vibration was able to enter a spot that the medicine couldn't, per se, like a microcosmic reattunement or something like this. So I've always been fascinated by what type of effects these can have. So I've studied a good chunk of my life. So to hear that you guys are working on bringing the science world, which is great, and so the Socratic method of thinking with, if these don't work, what are the variables that are causing this experiment to go a particular direction, as well as the older, the more traditional areas, because some of it is like a placebo effect. You go into a ceremony, there are things that they'll do, like put maybe a red dot on your head or forehead, or wear all white, that don't really have any effect other than the creating a deeper placebo effect, which helps the healing even further. So it's fascinating to see these two worlds kind of start to create a marriage together. Have you had any, like, what kind of conversations have you had with some of the elders or other curanderos in this space? Are you able to bring people like that in Canada?
Well, certainly, yes. I find those discussions fascinating. Now, the whole concept of ritualizing the psychedelic experience is an interesting one. So I'm aware that rituals have pros and cons. So generally, if you're defining ritual as somebody bringing specific ikaros to the table, or some specific way that they beat the drum, or some specific object that they believe has special powers, and they've structured this ritual with various cards. And if that's how we're defining ritual, so ancient, indigenous, traditional rituals, then there's a pro and a con. I'm aware that there's a benefit and a risk that comes with that. So before I explore that, just acknowledging that everything becomes ritualized. I mean, breakfast becomes ritualized and dinner becomes ritualized. It's doing the same thing again and again. So I'm not just talking about regular patterns. I'm talking about sort of the sacred objects that get used in certain sequences. So that's what I'm talking about, rituals. So psychedelic psychotherapy today isn't ritualized. You know, it's something that has routines, but not rituals in the way that I'm defining it. So I've looked long and hard about advantages and disadvantages of the ritual container of safety. And the advantages of rituals are that they provide a structure, they provide safety when somebody's having distress. If the ritual comes to them in the place of distress and envelops them with this music or the chant or the drum beat or the touch with the feather or whatever, it can have a profound belief system that gets activated in terms of healing, and that can be very, very helpful. So rituals can be portable and helpful and envelop people who are struggling. There can also be a challenge with rituals. And the challenge with rituals is that the people who offer the rituals tend to think that the ritual is special. It's their ritual. It's something they've worked incredibly hard to develop. They've worked with a lineage. They've been taught this particular ritualistic structure by the master. And they come to the table with a sense of importance, and they become the healer. So it is their healing that they're offering the poor person who needs healing. And I think that's actually problematic. I think that's very disempowering. Yes. And really the model that I work with is really a guide should be able to sit with somebody and find their own internal healing wisdom. And it's their own internal healing wisdom that needs to be activated. So the healing is not coming from the ritual master, it's coming from the person who needs the help. And if rituals don't give the healing to the person, they can actually be quite disempowering. So I think that we need to have a discussion about the pros of and the beauty of rituals that offer safety and portability, and the cons that people can get really sucked into believing that their ritual is the right way. And that can be quite problematic for a community when the great master arrives and is willing to offer their wisdom and won't be willing to listen to anybody else. So I'll just give you one example of one individual that I talked to who was very inflexible. And it was quite interesting how inflexible he was. So he wanted to offer ayahuasca ceremonies to individuals that had addiction concerns. That's the group that he wanted to run. So I thought that was an interesting idea, and I talked to him about it for a while. And then because individuals with addiction concerns often have HIV and Hep C, I gave him a stack of small cups. And what I suggested is that he pour the medicine that he was going to offer into his measuring cup, and then pour it into a small disposable cup that then would be drunk by the participant and then thrown in the garbage. So nobody would share the same cup. So nobody would share saliva. And it made sense from a public health perspective. It made absolute complete sense. You don't want to be responsible for the transmission of diseases, especially when you have a lot of them in the group around the table or around the room. And he absolutely and completely refused. And he refused because he said, it's not my tradition. So if traditions become inflexible, then we have a problem. You know, if it's this tradition, this is the way we do it, and we can't change it, and we can't update it based on new information, then rituals become a problem, not a solution.
Yeah, that's an extremely important point to note, I think. I've spent a lot of time studying some of the ancient ritual magic of the Judaic culture called the Kabbalah. And I think if you read through it with a very discerning mind, it's very easy to tell that ritual is in fact an arbitrary type of placebo, that what you're trying to do is create a comfort and an understanding with your patient. But it is entirely flexible, that there is no right or wrong way to do it. And I think again, the disempowering aspect of the healer looking like what changed instead of the person actually going through their own experience and making those changes themselves. It's significantly better to empower the individual. So I think it's a unique standpoint, because you have the traditional world that looks at it as something spiritual, which is a fairly easily cognizant viewpoint from where they're sitting. But also in the Western world of medicine too, we're looking at it from the idea of psychology. We know that, okay, if God doesn't exist, it's generally it's created in the people's minds because we create more morally constructed societies when we believe that we're accountable to each other, and that type of accountability is held in place by spirit or the divine, regardless of if it exists or not. So it's such a unique I guess melding of art and marriage there, because at one point we know that the ritual doesn't necessarily make a difference. Like, you can use all these different ideas, but it's important because of the if someone's mind is more open to them being healed, like a placebo effect, you're going to have better results in the long term anyways. Whereas obviously we know if you take a large dose of LSD, you're going to get high, but can we increase the efficacy of healing depression or making these people actually making changes in their life by using ritual properly?
Yes. So there is a middle ground between the two positions of ritual or no ritual. I do know an individual who gathers people together in a remote, secluded environment, and everybody that comes is invited to bring an element of the ritual themselves. And so what happens is the group sits down and they plan the ritual collectively. So there's no one individual that is sitting on the podium or up on the high pillow who is saying, I am the one who is leading this group. Now, admittedly, there is a leader, but he disempowers himself whenever possible, and he invites everybody to participate in the creation of the ritual. And his position is everybody brings a wound and everybody brings a healer. And so everybody can participate as healing in the process, and everybody can participate as needing to be healed. And that sort of philosophically works for me as an approach. So there's no right answer to this, but it's an interesting discussion. It's an important discussion, because I know that who is going to show up in this work are going to be a lot of people that believe that they are the healers. And I think that can be incredibly disempowering to people who actually need healing.
Yeah, very, very well said. I absolutely agree with you on that as well, that there's just in general, I think that space, the guru is a disempowering franchise, because it makes you think that someone else is better than you. And we know that this is not the case. So one of the ones that I've been really interested in studying for the last few years is Iboga. Again, it's Schedule 1 drug in the United States, which means it's supposed to have no medicinal use, but it's had an extremely potent effects on addictive personality types and actually overcoming heroin addictions in almost single settings with no withdrawal symptoms. And I know Canada had Iboga kind of in a free air, like I know you could order it to Canada over the last few years without it getting stopped in the mail. What's Iboga look like under Canadian legislation and law, and what kind of effects does it have? One sec, excuse me. What type of effects does it have in helping people?
So we've had a recent shift in terms of how Iboga is available in Canada.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. If you can actually continue on Iboga there, I have to, something hit my car. I have to stop it from beeping. I apologize.
Okay, I will answer the question anyway. Okay, so.
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, the wonder of podcasts. So yes, Iboga, the legislative structure around Iboga has changed recently in Canada. So historically, it was essentially ignored by the Canadian government. It wasn't classified as anything, and it was seen as relatively benign.
I apologize. Sorry about that. I think my dog tried to jump in the truck and set off the alarm. He wants to go.
Okay. No problem. What I was saying is Canadian legislation around Iboga has changed recently. Historically, it was ignored. It wasn't structured in any way. And then there was an incident that happened. And one of my colleagues runs an Ibogaine treatment center. And he was the source of the incident. He had a person who showed up to his clinic, and they had quite frankly, they had falsified their EEG screening material. You need, if you're going to provide Iboga in treatment context, you need to make sure people have really robust and healthy hearts, because it can be cardiovascularly challenging for people. And so he does this analysis, and somehow, I don't exactly know how, somebody had come up with a different EEG chart and gave it to him. So he believed that there was no problem, and there was a huge problem. So the person went to hospital and was in a coma for quite a while. And it was the federal government found out about it and decided that they had to do something about it, which makes complete sense. So if I was a federal government regulator and somebody had almost died with this treatment, you do have to respond. That brought them into the discussion. But what they did was probably as benign a response as they could have done. They could have just said, okay, this is criminalized. If you possess it or sell it, then you are you're subject to federal sanctions. But they didn't. What they said is, it needs to be regulated, and it'll be regulated based on special access. So if you want to provide this treatment, you can apply to provide it, and each case will be looked at individually by the federal government. So my friend is now working on applying for his first case, and he believes he'll be successful, but he hasn't had a response yet. So currently, it's available in Canada by special access. So it's prescription DAS special access is how it's available.
I see. I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, I actually ordered the raw Iboga root. I had my partner look after me. Well, I've ate probably, I don't know, around, none of this is health advice. No one should try to do this by themselves. I consider myself fairly experienced in that world, and I had someone take care of me. Obviously things can go wrong, and like you're saying with Iboga, it's a very strong stimulant, and the hearts can fail under some of these circumstances. Sad to hear someone ended up in a coma, but I remember I used to be able to order it directly from Africa, and that's no longer the case.
Yes. So just to be clear, the person did survive, and they're now doing well. They're fine. But it was certainly very challenging. It was challenging for the provider, and it was challenging for the family around it. It was challenging for everybody, and we want to avoid those kind of experiences whenever possible.
Absolutely. Has Iboga shown efficacy in any other fields of healing as well?
Well, Iboga is either used for psycho-spiritual explorations or for healing for addictions. Those are most of the work that is being done with Iboga. And with specifically a focus on heroin addiction, that seems to be the one that it's most useful in targeting. You know, the original discoverer of that property was Howard Lotsoff, who was a heroin addict, and he took Iboga just for fun, and he emerged from the experience not having a heroin addiction, which was amazing to him. And he spent his whole life advocating for it to become a part of the treatment process for heroin addiction. So when you say, is it showing efficacy, that's actually a technical question that has to do with double-blind placebo clinical trials. Usually when you show efficacy, you do it through a very specific process. And Iboga hasn't worked its way through that process yet. So it hasn't yet been turned into a legal medicine. It's widely available in the underground communities of people, both in Canada and Mexico, who offer this service, but it isn't offered by traditional addiction providers. It hasn't gone through the stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. And partly it hasn't gone through the process because there isn't a business model for that. And you think about the huge multi-million-dollar expense of a stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trial, there has to be a reason why someone would spend millions of dollars. And they usually spend millions of dollars if they see a profit at the end of the day. So people aren't going to, a company, a pharmaceutical company, for example, is not going to spend a huge amount of money to develop something that they can't make a profit at. And Iboga is a pretty good example of something the business model is very hard to articulate, because really who they're offering the service to is a very small subpopulation, people with heroin addiction concerns, and they only ever do it once or twice. So it's very hard to take that to any kind of board meeting and say, you know, we're going to make a fortune on this, because really what you want is something that people take regularly for chronic illnesses that they take over a very long period of time. So that's the business model. Ibogaine or Iboga doesn't fit that business model. So that's why it hasn't gone through the regulatory process to produce it as a medicine. It's not because it's ineffective. It's just because there isn't a business model to promote it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the downfalls of the modern medical industry as we have it today. It's focused on a consistent returning customer profit model instead of, okay, well, let's help these individuals and then move on. And that's what you see with Iboga. Someone who might have been addicted to heroin, they drop out with no withdrawal symptoms, and then they might never need to do it again. Whereas these companies in the pharmaceutical world seem to look for something that they can consistently sell you on, like that prolonged exposure model that you were talking about before.
Essentially, yes. Yeah. So we have a problem. We have a problem with developing these things into medicine. In fact, I believe that the MDMA study is the first. Well, I know that the first. Let me say that again. The MDMA study that I'm involved with is the first psychedelic that's ever been brought to market through the phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trial that is funded by the people. By the people, I mean no pharmaceutical agenda is on the table with us. It's simply funded by people who say, I believe in psychedelics and I really think that I should get behind this. And I understand that it costs a huge amount of money. This is a slight pitch for people to hit the donate now button of M.A.P.S Canada. But it's the only way that we can do the business. It's the only way that we can do the work if people fund us. And so it is actually really important. And that's how we're being funded. Nobody with pharmaceutical companies in their back pocket is showing up and saying, okay, I'll give you millions.
Yeah, that's an extremely important idea too. So we will have markhaden.com, all the links for M.A.P.S Canada, as well as M.A.P.S, the 5031C in the United States as well. So if you guys are interested in donating, I do know that I think you guys accepted around $1 million in Bitcoin early last year as well from the Pineapple Fund. So it's good to see that this decentralization, the model of crowdfunding, is actually who shows up, because the people are the ones that are affected. And if we want to see this research done, we're usually the ones that need to pay for it to get done. Thomas Campbell, he's doing some research in the field of physics as well, and he self-funded all of the experiments that they're doing at MIT right now.
Wow. Yes, it's important. And I really appreciate that the people have seen the benefit of this, and they see that having legal access to it is a good idea. And we've been hugely supported. And so I really appreciate, would like to offer a thank you to anybody that's listening that has already donated to M.A.P.S Canada. So thank you to everybody that's making this happen.
Yeah, I think as decentralization really starts to take hold here, we're going to see more and more things that take off like that, where the people's interest actually takes the power back again. It's been one of my favorite parts about this, like the fact that we can do a live stream and a conversation that thousands of people will see. This is only because the decentralization of power has, it's putting our sovereign individuals' rights back in the highlight, which is where they should be. So I'm grateful as well to anyone that's interested. Make sure you check out Mark Haden's website, as well as the M.A.P.S. If you're interested, the M.A.P.S website, again, the links will all be down below. If you're interested in supporting and contributing them through donations, just sharing this information, raising people's awareness is a hugely important part too, because a lot of the times, I was reading through some of your articles, and you said that in the early 1960s or 70s that they were starting to move ahead with clinical trials, but once the government thought that it was like disruptive to society, that they just pretty much put a hard hammer down on anything in the psychedelic world.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I like to reflect on the Canadian history, because it was actually a Canadian that invented the term psychedelic. Humphrey Osmond said, if you want to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. And it was in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, which was a hotbed of research. There were actually thousands of studies that were produced for about a 15-year period back in before actually LSD was used by the younger folks of the day, before the hippies exploded with their interest in psychedelics. There was a whole process by which psychiatrists were using LSD originally, psilocybin as well, and mescaline, the classical psychedelics. At first, they thought it would help them to understand mental illness. So the word that they used to describe it was psychomimetic. And then fairly quickly, they realized it actually wasn't particularly useful to helping them to understand schizophrenia. And so they coined the term hallucinogen, because people often see glorious visions and patterns and fractals when they're under the influence of these. But then that didn't work very well as well, because there's a lot more going on. People really have access to their unconscious minds in a way that they don't in normal everyday life. So the word psychedelic actually means mind manifesting. Now, the word psychedelic has a lot of cultural baggage associated with it, you know, psychedelic art and psychedelic culture. So we're trying to disconnect ourselves from the cultural aspect of the word and just really recognize that mind manifesting is probably as close to an accurate description of what a psychedelic does that we can come up with. So, well, also the term entheogen or entactogen, entheogen meaning connection to spirit, or entactogen being connecting to with self. Those words also have utility and they're helpful. But for me, the word psychedelic just means manifesting of the mind, and that's the word that tends to be preferred now by researchers, and that's why. But that word came from Canada, and there was a hotbed of interest, and so they worked their way around many different angles looking at psychedelics, and eventually came up with, I think if there was one conclusion from the research back then, is LSD is really useful for alcoholism. So one of my personal goals is to bring that back. I'd love to do a trial looking at LSD for alcoholism and really build on that historical research and build on it in Canada, because that's where it was done.
Yeah, the effects here could spread far and wide, but like you said, aiming at the low-hanging fruit that's easier to prove is probably the best bet to go. Now, you'd mentioned this a little earlier, your interest in ketamine. I had a German doctor friend who in the early 1950s was experimenting with MDMA and ketamine. What type of work have you been doing with ketamine?
Well, ketamine is legal in Canada. And there's certainly a lot of discussion right now about sort of ketamine clinics. And so there's, you know, the work today is not, I don't know of a ketamine clinic. There are individuals providing ketamine service, but I don't know anybody that's kind of put ketamine clinic on their door and then provide it within the context of something that's multidisciplinary. It seems that ketamine is useful for depression specifically. Now, I find that rather puzzling because I actually don't know why it's useful. If you think about the ketamine experience, if I have a little checklist in my brain about how to understand a psychedelic experience, and sort of revelation, spirituality, connection to others, reflection on self, need to self-disclose. So all of those those checklist, that particular checklist doesn't really apply very well to ketamine. What the experience is often very otherworldly. It really isn't about, you know, looking at one's own trauma. It's just about, you know, walking around on the planet Mars or in some, you know, old growth forest somewhere. It takes you somewhere else. You know, it's a dissociative anesthetic by its nature, and it really kind of disconnects you from your body. Now, why that's helpful for depression, I actually don't know. You know, it would make more intuitive sense to me that things like LSD and psilocybin that provide a spiritual context or reflection on self, or MDMA that provides, you know, a deep possibility to reflect and connect with others, those would be intuitively for me, you know, a logical way of approaching depression. But ketamine is really easy because it's legal. So, and it does seem to work. So I think we should just have it in what we do as one of the options.
Fascinating. I didn't realize ketamine is actually legal in Canada. It's a tranquilized animals. Correct?
Well, it's legal on prescription. It's not illegal to prescribe it and provide it within a context of medicine, just to be precise.
Oh, okay. So you can actually be prescribed ketamine nowadays. I had no idea.
You can go in and have, you know, a physician can appropriately apply ketamine. So there's on-label and off-label use. So what does that mean? It means that often drugs have, if you go into the CPS, the drug book that doctors use, there's this is how you use the substance. You know, this is what the substance was invented for, and this is how you use it. That's called on-label use. It's using it as is intended by the pharmaceutical company. Then there's off-label use, which is basically using it in different dosages that are recommended by the pharmaceutical company or for different indications. So using ketamine for depression is an off-label use of ketamine. But nevertheless, many drugs are used off-label. It's not, you know, it's something that the College of Physicians and Surgeons discusses and is engaged with the discussion, but it's recognized that it does happen. So ketamine needs to be kind of brought into mainstream and be brought on label for treatment for depression. And that's a process.
Wow, fascinating work you've been doing, Mark. Are there any conferences that people can meet up with you at over the next year, or any conferences that MAPS might be doing in the United States as well?
Oh, we're always, I'm very much on the conference circuit. I mean, we have in Vancouver, there's sort of two big conferences, which is the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference that happens at the University of British Columbia. And then there's the Psychedelic Psychotherapy Conference that happens in Victoria. And those are two ones that are happening in the next few weeks in Vancouver. But, I'm certainly out there on the conference circuit, and I always welcome discussions with everybody.
Well, beautiful. Hopefully we can catch up with you one of these days in person as well. We're running over an hour, so we'll keep it short. That way, hopefully in the future we can do another few calls to see what type of progress is being made. Especially the work that you're doing in the facilitator stuff is fascinating to me. Especially because the marriage of those two art forms, the Socratic method, which is can be very cut and dry, and the more abstract parts, which like the ritualization and how to incorporate some of the older empathetic reasoning behind these traditions as well is absolutely stunning to me. So I'm super grateful for your time today, Mark. Shout out to Trevor Miller for he's one of the chairman of MAPS as well in Canada, for helping us line up this interview. Is there anywhere else that we should send some of the Bear family to do more research if they're interested?
Oh, there's a whole community of people here that are very interested in this discussion. Beautiful.
So any of the links that you have, I'll make sure those are all put down below. If you guys like this content, you want to see more of it, smash that likes or the thumbs up button. If you're new to the Bear family, please subscribe and hit that little bell so you're notified. And follow Mark at his website, markhaden.com, as well as I think we can find you on Twitter. Is that correct?
I don't have a big social media presence. I do have some things that I tweet out, but it's not a huge part of my presence now.
Okay, that's fair. We'll make sure we send as many people your guys' way as possible. I think raising the awareness and the intellect about how profound the efficacy, especially like you're saying with MDMA in the treatment of PTSD, the rates of efficacy are so much higher that you'd almost think you guys were lying. That's how good it is. And so that's extremely positive news. I'm very, very excited.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate this discussion. Thank you for engaging.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your time with me. Like for me, this is one of the reasons why I dropped out of school when I was younger. Is I'd taken psychedelic mushrooms when I was about 15 years old, and I was really good at math and science. And I had this big conclusion where I could see that there was room for it, as well as perhaps an answer for where some of our older religions had come from. And then when I came back to school the next day and I realized that no one would fund me, I would probably be trying to throw me in jail for any of this stuff. I quickly realized to keep my mouth shut and move to a country where here I legally grow ayahuasca, I can legally grow marijuana, I can legally grow coca, I can grow all these sacred plants because there are no real defining laws around them yet too. So I'm very happy to see that the country that I was born in is actually making steps in the right direction towards studying and hopefully legalizing the medicinal use case for these.
Wow. Thank you. A pleasure. Let's keep this discussion going.
Sounds great. Hopefully I'll come visit you with one of the conferences with Trevor as well over the next year or two. I would love to meet in person and join in these conferences. They sound this stuff is fascinating to me. So to see it come mainstream is like a dream come true for me, because it means we were even though really.
Yes.
Thank you, Mark, Bear family. Thank you guys for supporting us today. We'll see you guys on the other side, and hopefully we can do more conversations like this that really break outside of the mold and bring discussions to the table that I think can affect many people that are having these problems as well. So Mark Haden, one more shout out to you and Trevor Miller and MAPS, both from Canada and United States, for doing the good work that you guys are doing. Someone needs to, so we're grateful that it's you. Have a great day, Mark. Thank you, Bear family. We'll see you guys again.